brother. You been having trouble with your bug? No worry. Don't worry. Sit back. Relax. We're going to show you how to fix them. Right here. On debugging the bug.
Hi. Welcome to Debuggin' the Bug. Today's going to be our last bug show for some time, it looks like. Cablecasting is going to suspend operations for a while. And we're real sorry to stop, but we're going to have a grand finale. We're going to take an engine out of a Volkswagen bus. And we've been working up to this for a while, I guess. Okay, the reason why we're going to take this engine out of this particular bus is because it's leaking oil, and it's leaking oil pretty fast. And it's making a real mess, and it's costing a lot of money to keep putting oil into it. And something is really wrong. So we want to pull the engine out to find out exactly why it's leaking oil. Now, you might have another reason for pulling your engine out. Maybe you threw a rod and your engine won't run at all. Maybe you need a new clutch. A lot of different reasons. But regardless, the procedure for taking the engine out is the same, and once you get the hang of it, it doesn't take too long. Pretty easy, especially in a bus. We'll see why. Now, if you haven't done this before, I really recommend that you get a hold of this book. This book will save you just all kinds of trouble. And it's called How to Keep Your Volkswagen Alive, a manual of step-by-step procedures for the complete idiot. And that's not meant as an insult, but what it does mean is this book, if you follow it, if you really read it and really do what it says, if you've never picked up a wrench before in your life, there's a good chance you can take an engine out and put it back in and have it actually work. And the only place I know where you can get this book for sure is the Whole Earth Access Store, way down on South King Street, down past the university. If you own any kind of Volkswagen, you really should own this book, even if you don't intend to take the engine out. Okay, now, what are we going to do to get this engine out of this bus? Yeah, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take some of this metal back here out of the way so that once we've lowered the engine out of its place, we can just pull it straight back and out. And we're going to take the bumper off, and we're going to take this back piece of metal off. Okay, let's take the piece of metal off first. Now, the tools we're going to be using here, just a few metric tools, basic metric tools. You need a set of metric sockets. Buy cheap ones at Gem if you have to. And a set of cheap metric open or combination wrenches. And then just some miscellaneous tools. You need screwdrivers. It's nice to have a scissors jack. You need either a pencil or a punch. And this you're going to use to stick in the gas line a little later to keep the gas from draining out of the gas tank while the engine's out. Okay, well, let's take our 13mm socket here on our ratchet wrench and take this back piece of metal off. We've got 4 big bolts to get out. And you want to make sure that you keep track of the place where all these parts came from. You don't want to just rip into this project and start pulling out parts and throwing them in a big barrel. You want to make absolutely certain that you yourself know exactly where they go, how it goes back together. Nothing's worse than taking something apart and putting it back together and having some really important looking pieces left over. So if you want to get some egg cartons maybe and put all the parts in the same place together, it's not a bad idea, particularly if you haven't done this too much. After a while, you sort of memorize things. But at first, don't make it any more confusing than it has to be. Okay, those 4 bolts are out. Now, there should also be some screws, 1 screw on each side holding this piece of sheet metal in place. This is an old bus, and people have worked on it before, and the screws are missing. So, it makes it easier. You see that it's loose. There's a piece of rubber stripping that we can just pull right out of the slot in the piece of metal and lift the whole thing out of the way. Put it aside. Okay, now we see our engine's much more exposed. You can really tell what's going on there. And now we got to take the bumper off. And that's not a hard job, but it can be kind of frustrating. Usually it's kind of rusted up. And there's nothing complicated about it. You just got to get some wrenches and sockets and get in there and do it. So I'm going to take a few minutes here by myself and undo the bolts that hold it in place. And then we'll come back and we'll get to the business of taking the engine out of the bus. Okay, I've got all the bolts out here with only 1 or 2 skin knuckles. So, you just sort of lift the bumper off. It's been wired in place here a little bit. There we go. And put it off to one side. Now we can really see what we're doing here. All this stuff's going to come out as one unit. We're going to drop it down and pull it out, and we got a nice open spot in the back to do it. Before we get into actually doing that, though, we need to make a lot of disconnections here. We need to unhook things that tie it all together. We'll start out with the electrical system. We need to disconnect all the wires that hook the engine into the rest of the car. Before I undo any of those wires, I'm going to undo the battery, and just to prevent any short circuits, any nasty little fires or anything. Disconnect either battery connection. In the Bug, it's just easiest to take off one of the terminals from the battery under the rear seat. In the bus here, it's easiest to take off the ground strap. It goes from one of the battery terminals to the metal frame of the bus. Just undo one 13mm bolt here. That holds that strap in place, and put the bolt and the washer aside and tuck the strap up out of the way so it's not going to touch anything. So your battery is no longer in the electrical circuit of your vehicle. Okay, now I've got a couple more things here. I've got a roll of masking tape and a pen, and this is so I can mark the wires I take off, and that may sound like some extra work, but it can come in very handy, be very, very comforting when you go to hook them back up again, and suddenly you're not quite as sure as you were when you took them off where they go. So as we take the wires off, we're going to make some sort of mark that means something to us and put a piece of masking tape around each wire, so we know exactly where it goes back onto. Now most of them will just be push-on connections, standard Volkswagen push-on connections. In the bus here we've got, on top of the generator, a couple of connections that we have to loosen with a little wrench of some sort. So I got a little adjustable wrench here, and we'll loosen these nuts to get those wires off. Now different Volkswagens are wired differently. The Bugs are different than the buses, and the new ones are different from the old ones. So you just need to sort of watch how yours is wired, how it comes apart, and the crucial thing is putting it back the same way it was when you took it apart. And each time you take a wire off, we'll tear off a piece of masking tape and write a little note to ourselves on it and put it around the wire. Okay, and if we just do that on every wire we take off, we'll have no troubles at all. Make things easy for ourselves. Okay, up on the carburetor here we've got some pull-off connections. You just wiggle them and pull the little metal connector right off, a little metal finger. Same down here on the coil. Just pull them loose. And there's one down here behind the distributor. It slips right off. That's the oil pressure sensor for your light. Okay. And this particular bus has one kind of sneaky one. way down behind the generator here, there's one that's goes to a screw. It's a grounding wire. So we'll just get that one loose. Reach around behind. Okay, I'm not going to actually mark all of these, but I would advise that it's a very good idea to mark them. Okay, that's all the electrical connections. The next thing is the accelerator cable, and if you have a very old Volkswagen, the choke cable. Accelerator cable comes through the engine, through the metal shrouding in the engine, up to the accelerator arm on the carburetor. And it just sort of sticks in there. It may have a spring on it, it may not. Depends on how old it is. If you have a real old vehicle, you'll have another wire similar to it coming through the shrouding to the top part of the carburetor. That's from the choke knob on the dashboard. Okay, the one to the accelerator is very important. Get a small screwdriver, stick it in the clamp, loosen it, and you can pull the accelerator cable end right out. But don't leave it there. Take the little clamp you loosened and pull it out of the carburetor and put it somewhere safe. Because this clamp will fall out otherwise and you'll lose it, and you can't drive your car without this little clamp. So it hooks your gas pedal to your carburetor. Okay, put that somewhere where you know where it is. Okay, if you have a choke, the choke's easy to disconnect, it just unclamps. Next thing we need to do is get rid of our air cleaner, and that's this big thing over here. It may be on the other side, it may be directly on top of the carburetor, on a bug. Wherever it is, get rid of it. This usually means unclamping it from the throat of the carburetor using a screwdriver. And then these ones that hang in the bus, you've got to get a wrench, 13 millimeters usually, get back up in there and unhang it. Hangs with a little bracket. There we go. Get the other nut off as well. If you're working on a real new Volkswagen, you're going to have a lot of other plumbing on it for emission control, you know, your anti-pollution devices. And I can't tell you about that. I don't like to work on the new ones. But just take everything off and make sure you know how it goes back on. Okay, there's almost always a little tube that goes up to the air cleaner from the oil intake. Just pull that right off. Lift the whole mess off the throat of the carburetor and pull it out. Okay, and this one, the rubber tubing has got a crack in it. That should be replaced eventually. It's not real important though. Okay, our engine's starting to look a little more out in the open. Get these wires back out of the way. Okay, now, one more thing that we've got to do is undo a couple of great big nuts. And these, you're going to have to just take my word for. There's no way you can see them on TV, and I haven't got any drawings that really show them very well. Where they are is directly around in front of this engine shrouding, up on top here. There's two of them, one on each side. You got a feel for them. They're 17 millimeters, and they hold they're two of the four nuts that hold the engine onto the transmission case. So you have to stick your head back in there and get all greasy and feel around and undo them. And if the bolts behind them start turning, you're going to have to send a friend down underneath the car to reach up and hold the bolts so that they won't turn. So You're just going to have to take my word for it that they're there. When you get a chance, on your own Volkswagen, reach around and feel them so you know what they feel like and where they are. And when you take your engine apart, read Muir. He's got a good description, a good little sort of guided tour on how to get to them. But they're kind of messy. It just takes some patience. So I'm going to go ahead and undo those two bolts by sticking my head around in front there. And when I get those off, we'll come back and discuss what our next step is to get the engine out. Okay. Well, we got both those nuts off. And you got to get them off any way you have to. Both the 17mm nuts on this side attached to 17mm bolts that come through from the front of the engine. So as I said, you may need a friend to go around and hold those bolts from turning while you get the nuts off. Okay, now one thing I want to mention right now before we go any further, if you're going to do an engine overhaul, now is the time to drain the oil. The oil is a real mess once the engine's out. And the engine's still hanging here, so if you need to drain the oil, get the drain plug out and drain the oil. Okay, we aren't going to do that. We're just going to check some things for oil leaks once the engine's out. Okay, now, also, to clear out things from beneath the engine, and I've got a scissors jack here that I've got centered underneath the engine, right smack dab in the middle, underneath it. A nice broad scissors jack. And I'm going to lower the engine on this thing once I've pulled it back out of its place where it fits. Okay, there's various ways to do this. You can use two scissors jacks and a board. That's real safe. You can just lower one side at a time. One man can handle it that way. This is going to take two men, one to balance the engine on top of the scissors jack and the other guy to turn the handle and lower it. Third method is to get a cinder block and a long piece of 2x4 and stick the 2x4 over the cinder block, holding the engine up, and get a couple guys out in the end of the 2x4, pull the engine back and have them lower it onto the ground. The thing only weighs about 200 pounds. Two men can handle it real easy. And if you're really desperate, which you really can just yank it backwards and drop it, although it's not a real great idea. You might damage the transmission spline. It can be done that way. Okay, all that's holding the engine in place now there are two studs along the bottom that go forward into the transmission case, and there's two nuts, one on each of those studs. Okay, so we've got to undo those two nuts, and then the engine can pull straight back and out and drop. Also, we've got to go under there and find the cloth-covered rubber tube, which is the gas line. Pull it off, and it'll spurt gasoline all over you. Watch your eyes. You undoubtedly get gasoline in your armpit, which really stings, but it'll go away after a while. And stick a pencil or a punch in the end of that rubber tube so the gas stops coming out. Okay, also, there are two wires, one on each side, up underneath, come from the front of the car, and may or may not be attached. In Hawaii, very often they aren't. And they control the heater flaps. If they are attached, you got to get them loose before you can pull the engine out, because or else they'll get hung up when you try to pull it down and out. So I'm going to crawl underneath there again. I've got my scissors jack in place here, so that the thing's not going to fall anywhere. And actually, it won't go anywhere until you pull it back, even after those two nuts are off the studs. My jack is ready here. The engine's jacked up. And I'm going to go undo those two big 17mm nuts, disconnect the gas line, plug it up, make sure the heater wires are disconnected, disconnect them if they're not, and then we'll come back and we'll actually pull the engine out. So let me duck underneath there again. Okay, we've got everything disconnected now. This engine is ready just to fall in our laps. All four bolts are disconnected. The gas line, accelerator cable, we pulled it back through from the front side. Everything is free and ready to come. It's still in place. The studs are still through the holes in the transmission case, and the scissors jack is underneath it. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to grab it and pull it back and keep it balanced on top of the scissors jack. And I'm going to have the guy who owns the bus actually turn the handle on the scissors jack and lower the engine down till it's close to the ground. Then we can both just sort of drag it back away from the bus. So we'll make sure there's room room for it to come, and we'll go ahead. Just grab it firmly. This thing is nothing to be scared of. It's not that heavy. And, okay, you may need to jack it up a little bit in order to help you pull it free. Just grab it on each side and start wiggling it. Okay, it's getting there. We're getting close. Okay, you may need to try jacking up and down during this process to get it to just the right place where it can slide free. Okay, it's free. Just about. You need to go up a little more. No, down. Okay, now we'll start lowering it. Okay, down. Well, it's out. Okay, sometimes it's smoother than other times, and we got a little hung up there, but it's free. And so, let's take a look at our engine now. Okay, the engine is entirely out of the bus. And what we want to know is, where's it leaking oil? So we're going to turn it around some more and look at the front side of the engine. Okay, let's get it turned around here. And there. Now let's see what it was that I was doing. First of all, we see the little bit of gasoline running out of the gas line here. One thing I did when I crawled underneath the bus, I took the rubber tube off this gas line, and while it dripped gas out of the gas tank, I stuck a punch in it, and a pencil would work just fine. Anything that's tapered and long and thin, you can get inside that tube to plug it up, is fine. Okay, these are the heater boxes, and there are great big flexible tubes that go on these round holes that carry hot air up to the front of the bus or the bug when you turn the heater on. So we had to pull those tubes out away from these holes. Okay, also in these heater boxes down here, we've got some levers, and there were cables coming from the front of the bus that were clamped with little clamps, a little nut and cylinder thing into this arm. And if those were connected, we had to disconnect those before we could pull the engine out also. Okay, the first two nuts that I undid from up on top were around behind on the front side of this piece of shrouding, and there are these two holes right here. The bolts go through the transmission case, through these two holes, and then around to the rear side of this piece of metal, and that's where I had to take the nuts off. Two nuts on top. The two nuts on bottom were on these two studs. These two studs go through holes in the transmission case, and there's a nut on each one holding it in place. So once everything was loose, we pulled the engine straight back, which pulled these studs out of the holes, There was also a spline, long piece of metal that went into the center of the clutch here. We had to pull it back off that spline, the whole engine and clutch assembly back off the spline, get it clear before we could drop it down. So those are the things that we couldn't see when I did them in order to get the engine out. Now you've got your engine out and you can do anything to it you want to. You can get a friend and you can lift it and put it on top of a bench or a table. Just carry it wherever you want to, inside your garage, out of the weather, and take your time and work on it. Take it all apart if you want to, rebuild it, do whatever you want to your engine. Now it's easy to work on, now that it's out of the vehicle. When you finish whatever it is you wanted to do, replace the clutch or whatever it was, find your oil leak, or do a complete rebuild job, then it's time to put it back in. And going back in, everything goes exactly the same as taking it out, except it goes backwards, of course. You're gonna jack it up into place, work it in, shove it in. It may take a little bit of time, and start connecting things up and tightening bolts and this and that. Everything just the reverse order that we took it apart. And you should have a good book there, a good Volkswagen book, to give you hints and to remind you about things as you go. But taking the engine out of a Volkswagen is a basic thing to know how to do. Once you can take an engine out with considerable confidence, you can save yourself all kinds of money, because you can do most of the mechanical things to your own Volkswagen that there are to do. If we'd had a Bug, it would have been exactly the same, except we couldn't have taken the bumper off. We would have had to lower the engine and then jack the Bug up really high so we could pull the engine out underneath the rear bumper. Aside from that, all the connections and hookups are just the same as what we saw in this bus. Okay, well that's it for our final show here on Debugging the Bug. We've seen how to take an engine out, how to get it loose so we can work on it. I'd like to thank very much Chip Ellis, who's been our producer-director for most of these shows, and our regular crew from Nanakuli High, and Pachyderm Productions, and Dick Price, who originally came up with the idea for this show about 1.5 years ago. I've had a real good time working on the show, and hope one of these days we'll be able to start it up again. So, take it easy, and good luck debugging your bug.